It began like a peaceful drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. The late afternoon light lay softly over the pine ridges, and the bitter cold slipped through the mountain gaps. Everything looked so calm. Or maybe that calm was the trap he'd been setting for weeks. A woman, 14 weeks pregnant, was locked inside an SUV by her own husband. He secured the doors from the outside. He poured gasoline in a ring around the vehicle, in the middle of a freezing winter afternoon on a deserted mountainside where not a single person passed by. Then he struck a match. You'd think her story ended right there, in the flames, in the black smoke, in the scream of metal as it gave way. But instead of saving her, he climbed into his mistress's car and drove off without looking back even once, as if the woman burning inside had never existed at all. And yet fate has a way of turning everything upside down in ways no one expects. Because at that exact moment, balanced between life and death, a convoy of glossy black vehicles came to a stop on the mountain road. In the lead car sat a man whose influence reached into the darkest corners of the city's shadows. A man no one dared to name. And he, with hands that had carried plenty of guilt, pulled her back from the edge of death. The one the world called a devil became the only angel she had that night. What came after was a ruthless fight to survive. Dark secrets dragged into the light, a love no one would believe, and a kind of justice her husband never imagined was waiting for him. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to support us. Share this video with the people you love, because everyone deserves to hear a story like this. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next moving story. The last wash of late afternoon was fading behind the peaks of the Blue Ridge when the black SUV glided along a winding road through pine forest. Madeline Shaw sat in the passenger seat, her back sunk deep into the leather, one hand resting lightly on her 14-week belly. A dull headache had been there since morning, pressing tight behind both eyes like someone was squeezing from the inside. But she didn't say a word. She'd learned not to speak a long time ago. Brandon Pierce was behind the wheel, one hand steady on the steering wheel, the other hovering on the gear shift. He wore a gray wool coat, his hair neatly combed, the faint trace of expensive cologne lingering in the cabin. From the outside, he looked like the perfect husband taking his wife away for a weekend retreat. "Mountain air will be good for you and the baby," Brandon said, his voice so gentle it was almost sweet. "Just relax. I'll handle everything." Madeline nodded and tried to smile. She wanted to believe him. She always tried to believe him, because if she didn't, she'd have to face a truth she wasn't ready to look at. The temperature display on the dashboard read 42 degrees Fahrenheit. She watched the number drop to 41, then 40. Outside, the pines were shifting from deep green into black, their trunks packed close together like a fence hemming the road in. The windshield began to fog from the outside, turning everything hazy, as if she were looking through frosted glass. Brandon's phone buzzed. He flicked his eyes down at the screen, then immediately flipped it face down on his thigh. But Madeline had seen it. Just a flash, half a second, but long enough to read the line that lit up on the bright screen. "Are you done yet? I'm waiting at the old spot." The sender's name sat above it, Kendra. Madeline's heart tightened, as if an invisible hand had closed around it inside her chest. Her breathing slowed. Her gaze stayed forward. But inside, something was breaking apart into small pieces. She didn't need anyone to explain. She didn't need more proof. Those two words, that name, the way Brandon rushed to hide the phone, it all said everything. There was another woman waiting for him. A woman who knew his plan for tonight. Madeline swallowed her tears. Her throat turned bitter and tight. But she didn't let a single drop fall. She was used to swallowing tears. 2 years with Brandon had taught her that tears didn't change anything. They only made him angrier, or more contemptuous. The temperature display slid down to 39, then 38. The air outside was turning colder fast. Brandon turned on the heater, but the warm blast only made Madeline feel more trapped, more short of breath. She felt the tiny pulse within her belly, light as a butterfly brushing the wall of her womb, and she placed both hands there, as if she could hold her child through the skin. This baby was everything she had. Then Brandon turned the wheel sharply to the right, guiding the SUV onto a narrow road Madeline had never seen before. No signs, no streetlights, not a single house on either side. The road climbed steeply, twisting upward through thick pine. The trees pressed in close, like enormous black shapes leaning down to watch the car pass. Above, The sky had become only a thin gray strip between the two walls of treetops. "Brandon, where are we going?" Madeline asked, her voice soft, but trembling at the end. "I want to get a little higher up," he answered shortly, not turning his head. His tone had changed. It wasn't sweet anymore. It was sharp and dry, like a knife folded shut. Instinctively, Madeline reached into her coat pocket for her phone. Her fingers met empty fabric. She tried the other pocket, then looked down at the floor, checked the door compartment. The phone was nowhere. Her heart began to beat faster. She forced herself to stay calm and tried to remember the last time she'd seen it. Before she got into the car, she'd put it in her coat pocket. She was sure of it. But now it was gone. In that moment, another thought slipped through her mind, colder than the air outside. Even if she had her phone, who would she call? She had no friends left. Brandon had cut every connection, systematically, starting 2 years ago. First her closest friends, telling her they weren't good for her. Then her coworkers, insisting she quit for her health. Then neighbors, distant relatives, all of them fading out of her life like fallen leaves she never got the chance to pick up. As for family, she didn't have any. She never had. Madeline stared out the window. The pine forest was black as ink. The temperature display jumped down to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The air inside the SUV felt heavy with something she couldn't name, but she could feel it clearly. It was like the taste of iron in your mouth before blood starts to flow. The baby kicked again, this time stronger, as if it sensed something was wrong too. Madeline tightened her hands over her belly. She didn't know where this road led. She only knew that inside this car, in the dark mountains and the dark woods, she was completely alone with a man she no longer recognized. Brandon slammed on the brakes without warning. The SUV shuddered, then came to a complete stop on a narrow stretch of road clinging to the mountainside. To the left was a sheer rock wall. To the right was a drop so deep the darkness had swallowed the bottom a long time ago. There wasn't a single house, not a single light, not a single other vehicle, only wind shrieking through the cracks in the stone, and the low, rolling hush of the pine forest above, like a whisper of something coming. Brandon turned off the engine, opened his door, and stepped out without a word. The door shut behind him, with a dry, heavy thud. Madeline watched him through glass fogged with cold. He walked around the front of the vehicle and stopped at the very edge of the road, right beside the abyss. In the weak spill of the headlights, she saw him lift his hand, and in his hand was something small she recognized instantly. Her phone. He'd taken it at some point she hadn't even noticed, maybe when she drifted off on the drive, or when she stared out the window and swallowed her tears. Brandon swung his arm and threw it hard. The phone shot over the edge, spun once in midair, then vanished into the dark. A second later, the sound of it striking rock echoed up from below. Clack, clack, clack. And then nothing. Madeline's stomach clenched. "Brandon, what are you doing?" she called, her voice breaking into a sob before it could even become a scream. Brandon turned back. He strode to the passenger side, yanked the handle, and wrenched the door open. A blast of bitter air rushed into the SUV like a giant hand slapping Madeline in the face. Before she could react, Brandon shoved her shoulder, forcing her back into the seat. Her spine hit the leather, and pain flared through her head in a hot burst. She looked up at him, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw something even more terrifying than his anger. She saw emptiness. His eyes held nothing. No rage, no remorse, no hesitation. Just 2 cold black holes. "That baby isn't mine," he said, his voice as calm as if he were talking about the weather. "You think I'm stupid enough not to know what kind of woman you are?" Madeline shook her head, tears spilling over. "No, Brandon, I never—" But she didn't get to finish. Brandon slammed the door shut. The metal rang against the frame in the stillness of the mountains. And then, immediately after, came a sound that turned Madeline's entire body to ice. Click, click, click. The central lock. All 4 doors locked at once from the outside. Madeline lunged for the handle. Nothing. She tried the other door. Locked. She slammed the unlock button on the panel. Useless. Brandon had disabled the inside release. Fear rose from her belly, climbed into her chest, up her throat, and tightened until she could barely breathe. Through the glass, she watched Brandon walk to the back of the SUV and open the cargo area. He dragged out a red plastic can, a gas can. Madeline's hands began to tremble. She struck the window with both palms, the glass so cold it numbed her skin. But she didn't stop. "Brandon, stop. Please, I'm begging you." He didn't look at her. He walked around the SUV, tipped the can, and poured gasoline in an even circle around the vehicle. The fumes surged up, sharp and suffocating, slipping through every tiny seam in the doors and seeping inside. Madeline coughed hard. Her eyes burned, her stomach twisted with nausea. She looked through the rear glass and saw Brandon toss the empty can to the side of the road. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a metal lighter. His thumb flicked. A spark jumped, small but unmistakable in the dark. A tiny flame danced at the top of the lighter. Brandon snapped his hand. The flame dropped to the pavement and touched the trail of gas. Fire erupted instantly, racing along the circle like a snake made of flame, sliding fast around its prey. In seconds, the SUV was surrounded by a low wall of fire, blue-tinged at first, then turning into a fierce, roaring orange. Madeline screamed. She pounded the glass like she'd lost her mind, punching, slapping, clawing, but the reinforced window didn't crack. She shouted Brandon's name. She begged. She spoke of the child inside her. But Brandon Pierce had already turned his back and walked away. He kept going, never looking back, never slowing, heading straight toward a pickup parked about 20 meters away, one Madeline hadn't seen before. A woman was waiting in the driver's seat. Even through the smoke and the fire, Madeline recognized the familiar shape of that silhouette, Kendra Hale. Brandon opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. The pickup backed up, turned, and sped away, disappearing past the bend in the mountain road. Not once did it return. Inside the SUV, the fire began to lick at the undercarriage. The tires burned with a wet, furious hiss, releasing a thick, choking stench of rubber. The metal body started to heat and pop, cracking like breaking bone. Black smoke, heavy and dense, rolled in through every gap, creeping into Madeline's nose and mouth. She coughed until her throat felt torn open. Her eyes burned so badly she could barely keep them open. She fumbled at the seatbelt. Her hands shook violently, her fingers slipping again and again over the button, unable to press it. She tried again, and again. The belt held her tight to the seat like the embrace of death itself. She kicked at the window. Once, twice, but her legs were going numb from smoke and terror, and the blows only made the glass tremble, leaving not even a hairline fracture. The heat inside the vehicle climbed by the second. Sweat, mixed with tears, and streamed down Madeline's face. She placed both hands on her belly. Inside, the baby gave a faint, gentle kick, as if trying to tell her something. She remembered the last ultrasound, the tiny heartbeat bouncing steadily across the black and white screen, the soft, rapid thump-thump filling the exam room like music. The child she spoke to every night before sleep, the child she'd promised to protect at any cost, was trapped with her in a steel cage that was burning alive. The smoke thickened. Madeline's chest tightened as if a rope had been cinched around it. Every breath became a battle. Her vision blurred, everything smeared into a gray-black haze. Her heartbeat went wild, fast then slow, pounding in her ears like a drum. Her legs had no feeling now. Her arms fell, no longer strong enough to strike the glass. One final thought slid through her mind, clear and colder than anything she'd ever thought in her life. No one knows I'm here. No one will look for me. No one is coming. She pressed her face into the narrow gap between the seat and the door, searching for one last pocket of clean air. There was nothing. Only smoke, fire, and darkness. Outside, the roar of the flames sounded like the breathing of a gigantic beast, swallowing the vehicle piece by piece. Metal groaned. Wind howled through the stone, and Madeline's consciousness began to fade, slowly, like a candle being blown out in a winter night on the crest of the Blue Ridge. At the same time, less than 2 kilometers north of the fire, a convoy of 3 glossy black SUVs was moving slowly along the Blue Ridge mountain road. The vehicles drove in a steady line, keeping the exact distance between them like a military formation, headlights slicing through the cold mist ahead. Inside the middle vehicle, Ryder Blackwell sat in the back seat, his spine settled against black leather, a phone pressed tight to his ear. He wore a black 3-piece suit, the cuff of a white dress shirt showing just enough at his wrist, and on his finger a plain silver ring with no pattern. His face was sharp as a blade, his jaw set hard, and a small scar ran across the tail of his left eyebrow, giving his gaze a threatening edge even when he didn't mean to threaten anyone. His voice was low and cold as he spoke into the phone, each word dropping like a stone into frozen water. "I don't care what he said. This needs to be handled before midnight. If I hear his name one more time by morning, then the next problem that needs handling is you." He didn't yell. He didn't snarl. But the silence after each sentence weighed heavier than any shouted threat. The person on the other end only managed a single yes, then hung up. Ryder lowered the phone to his thigh, closed his eyes for 2 seconds, then opened them again. He turned to look toward the very back through the rearview mirror. Penny Blackwell sat there, 8 years old, brown hair tied in a ponytail that slanted slightly to one side, big round eyes fixed on the window. On her lap rested a folder of sheet music, and beside her sat a pale pink backpack with a bunny on it. She'd just finished her piano lesson in the small town at the foot of the mountain, and Ryder had personally picked her up, as he did every Thursday afternoon. "Penny," Ryder called, and his voice changed completely, lighter, softer, as if the man who'd just issued an order in ice had been someone else. "What'd you learn today?" Penny turned, her eyes lighting up. "My teacher taught me a new piece, Uncle Ryder. It's so hard. But I can play the first part already. I'll play it for you when we get home, okay?" "Okay," Ryder said, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not enough to be called a smile, but enough for Penny to know her uncle was pleased. He watched her through the mirror, his gaze softening in a way so rare that no one in the underworld had ever seen it in him, and if they had, they probably wouldn't have believed their own eyes. Penny was the daughter of his older brother, who'd died 6 years ago. Ryder had taken her in from that day, and for 6 years, through all the cold phone calls, the ruthless decisions, the sleepless nights, Penny had been the only thing that kept some part of him alive. Finn Gallagher sat in the front passenger seat, 40 years old, broad-shouldered, square-faced, his salt and pepper hair cut close to the scalp. He'd been Ryder's right hand for more than 10 years, the only person allowed to ride in the same vehicle with the boss without needing an invitation. Finn was checking his phone, scrolling through messages with an index finger thick as a hammer handle, when suddenly Penny leaned forward and pointed between the 2 front seats. "Uncle Ryder, smoke." Her voice rose in surprise. Ryder lifted his head and followed the line of her finger. Ahead, a few hundred meters in front of the convoy, a column of smoke was rising in the middle of the pine forest. Black smoke, dense, heavy, rolling up into the gray sky like a giant fist clenching tight. It wasn't campfire smoke. Ryder knew that instantly. He'd spent his whole life around violence, around things that burned and things that were set on fire, and the instinct in him recognized it before his reason could even begin to sort it out. Smoke that black only came from rubber, plastic, metal, and gasoline. Smoke like that meant a vehicle was burning, and in a place this empty, on a mountain road with no houses, no gas station, a burning vehicle wasn't an ordinary accident. Someone was dying. "Stop the car," Ryder ordered. The driver up front slowed immediately. The whole 3-vehicle convoy pulled over and stopped, engines still running, headlights still on, shining straight into the wall of smoke ahead. Finn turned to Ryder, his brows tightening. "Not safe, boss. Could be a trap. We just came out of that meeting. We shouldn't get mixed up in anything strange." Ryder didn't answer. He opened the door and stepped out. The Blue Ridge cold hit him in the face like a slap, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, biting all the way into his jawbone. But a second later, he felt something else. Heat. From up ahead, the heat of the blaze pushed back on the wind, unnaturally warm against the skin-cutting cold. Ryder moved fast toward it, then broke into a run. The soles of his leather shoes struck the freezing asphalt. Smoke shoved into his nose, the stink of burning gas, burning rubber, melting plastic. He pulled up the collar of his suit to cover his mouth, but his eyes stayed wide, scanning through the haze, searching. Then he saw it. In the middle of flames licking around the body of the vehicle, a dark-colored SUV lay motionless on a narrow stretch of road. Fire had spread under the chassis and along both sides, but the windows hadn't shattered completely, and inside, through glass blurred with smoke, Ryder saw a figure. A hand slammed against the window, weak, slowing, then slower still. He ran closer, eyes narrowed against smoke and heat. Through the dirty glass, he saw more clearly. A woman, her face black with soot, her mouth open, but the scream couldn't get out anymore, and below, where her arms were wrapped tight, was the unmistakable curve of a pregnant belly. Ryder Blackwell stood there for a second. Just 1 second. He'd witnessed plenty of death in his life, He'd caused more than his share of it. He'd learned to step over bodies without looking back, learned to watch blood spill without his heart adding a single extra beat. But on that empty mountain road, facing a burning car, watching the small, desperate hand of a pregnant woman strike weakly against the glass like a final plea, he couldn't step past it. Something inside him, something he'd believed had been dead for a long time, jerked awake. He whirled and shouted back toward the convoy. "Finn, a crowbar. Bring anything you've got that can break the glass. Now." Ryder sprinted toward the burning SUV, and the heat hit his face the way an oven hits you when you open the door. He grabbed the passenger side handle and yanked. Locked. The metal was so hot it seared his palm instantly. He let go and saw the red welt blooming across his skin. He tried the rear door. Locked. The other side. Locked. Every door was sealed from the outside. Someone had deliberately trapped the woman inside. The thought tightened Ryder's jaw until it ached. He spun and ran back to his own black SUV, parked about 15 meters away. Finn was already outside, eyes flicking between the flames and his boss, trying to understand what was happening. Ryder didn't explain. He opened his rear door, pulled a handgun from a hidden compartment beneath the seat, flipped it, and gripped the butt tight. Then he turned and ran straight back to the burning SUV. The fire had reached the hood. The front end glowed a brutal orange-red. Metal crackled like bone under the heat. Ryder stood at the passenger window, where he'd just seen a woman's hand tapping weakly from inside, and swung the gun butt hard into the glass. The first strike bounced off. The reinforced window on this model was built to take impact, built to protect whoever was inside. But today, that protection was killing her. The second strike came harder. He angled the butt slightly to drive the force into a single point. The glass shuddered but held. Behind him, Finn understood. He ran to the convoy's trunk, yanked out a tire iron, and hurried back with it. "Boss, let me," Finn said, but Ryder snatched the iron from him. Farther up the road, Penny stood by the third SUV, both hands clenched together, her face ghost white in the firelight. "Uncle Ryder, hurry!" Her voice tore through the wind and the roar of the flames. Inside the burning vehicle, Madeline was slipping away. Her hand still rested on the glass, but it wasn't pounding anymore. Her fingers only pressed lightly now, then slid down in slow motion, leaving streaks of sweat and soot on the smoke-clouded window. Her head sagged to one side. Her eyes were half closed. Ryder saw it all through the dirty glass, and he knew he didn't have much time. The third blow landed with the tire iron on the upper right corner of the window, where the glass was thinnest. A small, sharp tick, but not enough. For the fourth, he changed his stance and dropped his full body weight into it, the iron slicing through the scorching air. A hairline crack appeared, running from the corner toward the center like lightning across a frozen lake. The fifth strike hit that crack dead on. A web of fractures burst outward, dense and spreading fast. The glass was close. Ryder drew a deep breath. The air tasted like burning gasoline and melting rubber, and it scraped his lungs on the way in. He stepped back half a pace, raised the tire iron to shoulder height, and brought it down a sixth time with everything he had. The window exploded. Thousands of tiny shards sprayed out, glittering in the firelight like a rain of crystals. At the same time, a surge of heat and black smoke blasted from inside the SUV, strong enough to shove Ryder back 2 steps. He wrapped the sleeve of his vest around his right forearm and dove through the broken frame. Inside, the heat was like a steel furnace. The smoke was so thick he could barely see. He reached out, groping until his hand found Madeline's shoulder. She didn't respond. He dragged his hand down, searching for the seatbelt latch. The belt still held her pinned to the seat. Ryder pulled a switchblade from his pocket, snapped it open one-handed, and sliced straight through the belt. The strap parted with a clean pop. He slid both arms under Madeline's armpits and hauled her toward him. Her body was so light it hurt him, light as if the fire had already taken part of her away. Her clothes were scorched in several places. The edge of her coat still smoldered with tiny, hungry flames. The ends of her hair were singed, strands falling onto his shoulder as he lifted her through the shattered window. The skin along her back radiated heat through the fabric, and he knew burns were waiting underneath, raw and fierce. Ryder pulled Madeline tight against his chest and ran. He ran away from the burning vehicle, his boots striking the freezing pavement, his arms locked around her as if letting go would make her disappear. After about 15 meters, he lowered her onto the icy ground at the edge of the road. The earth, hardened by the cold, immediately began to cool the scorched fabric clinging to her. Ryder ripped off his vest, a tailored cashmere piece he'd worn to an afternoon meeting, and covered her with it. He'd barely finished when he heard the hiss, a high, piercing hiss from the SUV. The fire had found the fuel tank. "Get down!" Ryder shouted to everyone, and he threw his body over Madeline. A fraction of a second later, the SUV blew apart. A massive fireball burst upward and lit the night sky over the Blue Ridge, turning darkness into daylight for one blinding instant. The heat wave slammed into them like an invisible wall, scorching and brutal, sweeping across Ryder's back. He wrapped his arms tighter around Madeline, using his whole body to shield her from the blast. Shards of metal rained down around them, clattering against the road. When the worst of the heat passed, Ryder lifted his head. Behind him, the SUV was nothing but a blackened skeleton of steel, flames still licking at the wreckage. He looked down at Madeline and checked her breathing. Her chest rose and fell, faintly, so faintly, like a butterfly trying to open its wings after a storm. Weak, but there. She was alive. Madeline's eyes opened slowly. The first thing she saw was a stranger's face. Features cut sharp as if carved from stone. A small scar ran through his left eyebrow, about 2 centimeters long. A squared jaw, thin lips, the kind of face the world would step back from when it saw it. But the depths of his gaze staring down at her in that moment held nothing cold at all, only worry. Real worry, the kind Madeline had never once seen in Brandon's eyes in 2 years. "You're safe now." "I've got you," he said. His voice was low and slow, every word shaped carefully, as if he needed to be sure she heard him, even with her ears still ringing from the explosion. Madeline couldn't answer. Her throat burned, her lips were split, her eyes stung, but she heard him. She heard every word, and she did the only thing her body still had the strength to do. She rested her head against his chest. Inside her, the baby kicked once, then again, as if it wanted to say it was still here, still alive, still fighting with its mother. Around them, 6 or 7 men in black from Ryder's convoy spread out and formed a protective circle. No one spoke. No one asked questions. They just stood there in the freezing Blue Ridge wilderness, headlights cutting through the smoke, surrounding an unnamed woman their boss had just pulled out of hell. The fire still burned behind them. The mountain wind lifted embers into the night like thousands of red fireflies. Penny stood beside the third SUV, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't make a sound. She watched her uncle holding the strange woman on the frozen road, and even though she was only 8 years old, she understood something many grown-ups take a lifetime to learn. Some moments change everything, and this was one of them. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes after Finn's call. Red and blue lights flashed through the pine forest, reflecting on the dew-wet road like smeared streaks of blood across glass. Paramedics ran in with a gurney and an oxygen tank. Ryder was still sitting on the cold ground, holding Madeline in his arms, the suit vest draped over her body, soaked through with sweat and soot. When 2 paramedics knelt beside them, Ryder slowly transferred her into their hands, gentle as if he were setting down something more fragile than anything he'd ever touched. They fitted an oxygen mask over Madeline's nose and mouth. She drew in air, each breath small, slow, painful. But it was the first clean breath she'd had after nearly 10 minutes of smoke. On the way to the hospital, Ryder rode in his own SUV directly behind the ambulance. Penny sat beside him, silent, both hands gripping the edge of his coat. She didn't ask anything. She only watched the red lights flashing ahead and held on to her uncle's hand. At the hospital, Madeline was rushed straight into the emergency room. The door swung shut. The white light inside blazed through the small window. A blood pressure cuff inflated and released. A heart monitor sounded its steady beeping. A nurse started an IV in Madeline's arm, while Dr. Reeves, a gray-haired man with calm eyes, placed a fetal heart monitor against Madeline's belly. The room went quiet for a few seconds. Then the sound came. Thump, 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 thump. The fetal heartbeat, tiny but steady, filling the emergency room like a message that life was still holding on. Dr. Reeves checked her blood oxygen level, her lungs, and the burns across Madeline's back before stepping out into the hallway. He looked at Ryder, the only man who had been waiting outside the emergency room door since the ambulance arrived. "She inhaled too much smoke," Dr. Reeves said. "Temporary lung damage. The burns on her back aren't too deep, but they'll need special care. The fetus is stable for now, but very fragile. Any more shock could put it in danger." Ryder nodded. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't leave. He just stood there, his back against the hospital's white wall, arms folded over his chest, eyes fixed on the emergency room door, as if he were guarding something more valuable than anything he'd ever protected in the underworld. On a row of blue plastic chairs a few steps away, Penny sat curled up with her knees on the seat. She'd asked a nurse for a sheet of paper and a pencil. With the messy lines of an 8-year-old, she drew a woman lying on the ground, flames in orange and red surrounding her. Beside the woman, a man bent down, lifting her up. Penny darkened the man's eyes in the drawing, then glanced at her uncle standing in the hallway, and kept drawing. About 40 minutes later, hurried footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Heavy, urgent, the smack of leather shoes against polished tile. Brandon Pierce burst through the ER doors, his face flushed, hair fallen out of place, coat rumpled. He looked around with wide eyes, his mouth already beginning to tremble before he spoke, a tremble carefully calculated to look like a husband panicking because his wife had been in an accident. "Where's my wife?" he shouted, his voice cracking in the right place at the right time. "Can someone tell me where my wife is? She's been unstable lately. She's threatened to hurt herself multiple times. I tried to get her out of the car, but she locked herself in, jammed the mechanism so I couldn't reach her, and drove off in a mania." He clutched his head, slumping against the reception counter, his shoulders shaking in waves. If this were a film set, he'd deserve an award for that performance. Behind Brandon, Kendra Hale walked in. She wore a long black coat, her hair neatly arranged, her eyes already rimmed red, tears sliding down her cheeks in a perfect way, as if she'd practiced crying on the drive to the hospital. In her hand was a phone, the camera pointed straight ahead, recording. "She threatened us," Kendra told a police officer standing nearby, her voice trembling just enough. "She said she'd hurt herself and then blame us. We tried to help, but she wouldn't listen. Please, you have to understand." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, then gave a small sob at the exact moment the phone camera angled toward her face. The officer wrote notes, his eyes narrowing with skepticism. The preliminary report from the mountain showed the SUV's locks were tampered with from the exterior, a physical impossibility if she had been alone. A nurse looked at Brandon with caution and pointed toward the emergency room. Brandon lunged forward, but before he reached the door, he stopped short. Ryder Blackwell was standing directly in front of it. The two men looked at each other. Brandon was half a head taller than Ryder, but in that moment he felt himself shrink. There was something about this man that Brandon recognized instantly, by raw survival instinct. The tailored suit, smeared with soot, still carried the unmistakable mark of money, the handmade leather shoes, the scar through the eyebrow, and his obsidian eyes, pinning him without blinking, without heat, without disgust, only a total stillness Brandon had seen only in truly dangerous men, the kind who didn't need to get angry because they knew anger was a luxury for the weak. Behind Ryder, 6 men dressed in black stood spaced along the hall, arms crossed or hands in their coat pockets, but all of their eyes were on Brandon. "Stay away from my wife," Brandon said, trying to reclaim the authoritative tone of a lawyer. But the words had no weight. They rose and fell onto the hospital floor like a counterfeit coin. Ryder didn't answer. He didn't need to. He only watched Brandon, calm and patient, like he was watching an animal walk deeper into its own trap. The silence stretched 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7 seconds. Brandon looked away first. He stepped back half a pace without understanding why his feet had moved on their own. There was something in that man's eyes that made every lie in Brandon's mouth suddenly feel thin as paper in front of flame. Brandon turned, grabbed Kendra by the arm, pulled her aside, the two of them whispering in a rush. Ryder watched, missing nothing. The way Brandon clamped around Kendra's wrist, the way she flicked a glance toward the security camera, then quickly put her phone away. The way they traded looks like two accomplices, editing a script. Ryder had seen enough. He turned to Finn, who stood 2 steps away, and spoke low, only loud enough for Finn to hear. "Track him. Every step. I want to know where he goes, who he meets, who he calls, what he spends. Everything." Finn nodded without asking a single question. He knew when the boss gave an order in that voice, it wasn't a request. It was a sentence. Ryder looked back at the emergency room door. Inside, the fetal monitor kept sounding its steady, tiny rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. He didn't know the woman's name. He didn't know what she'd lived through before he found her in the fire. But he knew one thing. The man who'd just staged a performance in front of him was the one who had locked her inside that vehicle. And Ryder Blackwell wasn't the kind of man who reacted on feeling. He was the kind of man who planned, and the plan had just begun. Brandon stepped out of the emergency ward to take a phone call, one hand pressing the device to his ear, the other shoved deep into his pocket, his mouth working in urgent whispers Ryder couldn't make out and didn't need to. He knew that tone. It was the voice of a man trying to patch a plan that had sprung a leak. The moment Brandon disappeared around the corner of the hallway, Ryder glanced at Finn and walked into Madeline's room. The door eased shut behind him. Inside, pale white hospital light washed over Madeline's face as she lay in the bed. An oxygen mask still covered her nose and mouth, her breathing slow, one measured rise and fall at a time, as if she had to remind herself with every inhale that she was still alive. Her eyes were half closed, dark circles ringed beneath them, her skin dulled to ash by soot the nurse hadn't fully wiped away. An IV line was taped to the back of her left hand. Her right hand rested on her pregnant belly. The fetal heart monitor kept up its steady thump-thump, the only sound in the room besides the soft rustle of the blood pressure cuff inflating and releasing. Ryder pulled a plastic chair closer and sat down. He didn't speak. He just sat there, silent, and waited. He knew that for someone who'd just almost died, another person's rush could feel as terrifying as the fire. Madeline opened her eyes slowly. She saw him, and her body didn't flinch. That was the first thing Ryder noticed. She wasn't afraid of him. After everything she'd just survived, this woman looked at a stranger with a scar on his face and an entourage dressed in black, and she wasn't afraid. Maybe because she'd already met the most frightening thing there was, and it wore a gray suit, expensive cologne, and called itself her husband. Madeline lifted the oxygen mask slightly off her mouth. Her lips were cracked. Her voice was nothing but a dry, raw whisper, but each word fell heavy as stone. He tried to kill me. Ryder didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just looked at her and waited for her to keep going, and that patience was what Madeline needed most, right then. She told him, slowly, in fragments. Her voice kept fading out and returning like a candle fighting the wind. She told him how Brandon stopped on that empty mountainside, how he threw her phone into the ravine, how he opened the door, shoved her back into the seat, and looked at her with eyes that held nothing at all. She told him about the click-click-click of the central lock, the stench of gasoline seeping through the seams, the fire racing in a circle around the vehicle. And she told him about the last moment she saw Brandon's back as he walked away, never once looking over his shoulder, heading straight for the pickup where Kendra was already waiting. His face hadn't looked angry. It hadn't looked sad. It hadn't looked like anything, just empty, as if she wasn't a person, only a problem that needed to be handled. Ryder listened to every word. He didn't interrupt, and his face didn't change, but the hand resting on his thigh had curled into a fist, his knuckles gone white. When Madeline paused to breathe and a small coughing fit folded her in on herself, Ryder asked gently, "Do you have anyone? Family? Friends? Anyone you can call?" That question, those few simple words, "Do you have anyone?" hit Madeline harder than anything else that night. Harder than the fire. Harder than the smoke, because the answer she had to give was the truth she'd buried for years. Madeline shook her head slowly. She stared up at the white ceiling as tears slid back into her temples and soaked into the singed strands on her pillow. "I grew up in foster care," she said. So softly Ryder had to lean closer. "No one ever kept me for long. I went from one home to the next. Then I aged out and I was on my own." She paused, swallowing against the pain. "Brandon was the first person who said, 'I love you.' The first person who bought me flowers, who opened car doors for me, who told me I deserved to be happy. I thought it was home. I thought I finally had somewhere I belonged." Her voice broke on the last word, but it turned into a prison. Silence settled. The fetal monitor kept its steady thump-thump-thump. The blood pressure cuff hissed as it tightened and released. Pale light hung over two strangers in a cold hospital room. Ryder looked at the small swell of Madeline's belly, where a tiny life was still holding on with stubborn courage after tonight. Then he looked up and met her eyes. His unyielding gaze, the one that those in the dark world knew never made empty promises, held hers without blinking. "No one touches you anymore." He didn't say, "I'll try to protect you." He didn't say, "Everything's going to be okay." He said it like a sentence being handed down. 5 words, nothing more, nothing less. carrying the weight of a vow Ryder Blackwell had never given to anyone except Penny. Madeline looked at him, and for the first time in years, she felt something flicker deep in her chest, warmer than the fire that had almost killed her. She couldn't name it, but it was there. About an hour later, when Ryder stepped out to speak with Finn in the hallway, the hospital phone on the bedside cabinet began to vibrate. An incoming call from an unknown number. Madeline hesitated, then picked up. The voice on the other end froze her in place, not because it was frightening, but because it was so gentle. "Madeline, I know how you feel," Kendra Hale said, her tone soft, warm, friendly, almost sincerely so. "He promised me beautiful things too. I understand the pain you're going through. I truly do." Madeline didn't speak. Her fingers tightened around the receiver. Kendra continued, her voice still velvet smooth. "Do you remember exactly what happened tonight? I'm asking because I'm really worried about you. Sometimes after trauma, memory can get distorted. The doctors say smoke can affect perception. Are you sure about what you saw? Is it possible you're mistaken about something?" Each question was sugar poured over a blade. Madeline listened, and for the first few seconds, she almost believed her. She almost let that voice shake her, because this was the first time since the fire that anyone had said, "I understand you." But then she heard it. A tiny click on the line, the sound of a recording app being turned on, and everything became clear as crystal. Kendra hadn't called because she cared. Kendra had called to record her. Every question was designed to bait Madeline into saying something vague, something uncertain, something that could be twisted. "I don't remember clearly. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not sure." Those sentences, cut and stitched the right way, would become evidence in court that Madeline was unstable, that her testimony couldn't be trusted, that Brandon Pierce was the victim of a delusional wife. Madeline hung up. She didn't give her a single extra word. Her hand shook as she set the receiver down. Not shaking with fear, but shaking with the realization that she wasn't only facing a husband who wanted her dead. She was facing two people, calculating, organized, moving in lockstep, willing to do anything to turn her from a victim into a suspect. When Ryder came back and saw Madeline's face whiter than the sheet, she told him about the call. Every detail, Kendra's sweet voice, the leading questions, the click of the recorder. Ryder listened, his expression unchanged, but his eyes darkened by one shade, like a sky right before the storm breaks. "She'll pay for it," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of a truth that was about to happen, the way someone says the sun will rise tomorrow. And Madeline, looking into those dark eyes, believed him. It was 2:00 in the morning. The hospital was sunk in a thick, heavy silence that only places filled with people fighting between life and death can hold. The emergency wing hallway was empty, lit only by the pale white glare of fluorescent lights on glossy tile and the soft whoosh of the ventilation system overhead. The night shift nurse sat at the desk at the end of the corridor, her head drooping onto the computer keyboard. Hospital security had finished their last round 30 minutes earlier and was now in the break room on the ground floor. That was the precise gap Brandon Pierce had been waiting for. He slipped through the emergency wing's side door, a black hoodie pulled low to hide half his face. He'd swapped his shoes for soft-soled canvas ones, moving without a sound across the tile. He knew Madeline's room number. He knew the exact hour the nurses changed shifts. He knew when security made their rounds. Because Brandon Pierce was a lawyer, and the best lawyers aren't the ones who talk the prettiest. They're the ones who prepare the hardest. He pushed open Madeline's door. It swung in without a sound. Inside, the only light came from the fetal monitor's green blinking display and the small lamp on the oxygen tank glowing red-orange. Madeline slept on the hospital bed, an oxygen mask covering her nose and mouth, her chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. One hand still rested on her pregnant belly. Even in sleep, she was guarding her child. Brandon stood at the foot of the bed and stared at her. Not with the look of a husband worried for his wife, but with the look of a man weighing profit and loss, risk and reward. If Madeline lived, she would tell the truth. She would tell the police, the lawyers, the court about the night on the mountain. And once she spoke, everything Brandon had built would collapse. The legal career he'd spent 10 years constructing, the assets, the house, the cars, the bank accounts, and most of all, the $2 million in life insurance he'd bought on Madeline 3 months earlier, the money he needed to cover debts no one could ever know about. All of it would vanish the moment she opened her mouth. Brandon's eyes settled on the oxygen line. A clear plastic tube ran from the oxygen tank to the mask on Madeline's face. That tube was keeping her breathing, keeping her alive. His fingers rose and touched the line. His skin was cold. His breath turned thin and quick. He wrapped his hand around the plastic and slowly tightened. Madeline stirred faintly in her sleep, her lashes trembling. The fetal monitor still kept its steady thump, thump, thump. He only had to pull the line free. Only a few minutes without oxygen. She was already weak. Her lungs were already damaged. It would look like a natural complication. No one would suspect a thing. Brandon's fingers began to pull. The door opened. Not loudly, not suddenly, simply opening, as if someone had been standing just outside the whole time, waiting for this exact moment. Finn Gallagher stepped into the room. The hallway light spilled behind him, throwing a large, dark shadow across the hospital floor. Finn saw Brandon's hand on the oxygen line. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask. He didn't warn. Finn's broad hand seized the collar of Brandon's hoodie, spun him, and slammed him against the wall. Brandon's back hit the white paint with a heavy, controlled thud, hard enough to pin him but careful enough not to wake the patient in the next room. Precise, strong, quiet. That was how Ryder Blackwell's men worked. "I'm just checking on my wife," Brandon rasped, eyes bulging, both hands clawing at Finn's iron grip at his throat. She was having trouble breathing. "I only wanted to make sure the oxygen line was working right." Finn didn't answer. He held Brandon to the wall with one hand like a feral cat, and with the other he pulled out his phone and called the boss. Ryder arrived in less than 4 minutes. He walked into the room, looked at Brandon pinned to the wall under Finn's grip, then looked at Madeline still sleeping on the bed. The oxygen line shifted to one side but still connected. Then Ryder lifted his gaze to the corner of the room. A hospital security camera was mounted high, a small red light blinking steadily. It had recorded everything. From the moment Brandon entered, from the moment he stood there staring at the oxygen line, from the moment his fingers closed around the plastic tube, all of it. Ryder turned back to Brandon, and he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile, not a mocking smile, not the grin of a man who'd just won a card game. It was the smile of a beast watching prey walk into a trap with its own feet. Cold. Still, certain, that smile was more frightening than any punch Finn could have thrown. "You just signed your own sentence," Ryder said, his voice as light as passing air. But each word driving into Brandon like a nail. Brandon stopped struggling. For the first time that night, he was truly afraid. The security footage was copied and sent to the police department before dawn. The police arrived at the hospital at 6 o'clock. Brandon was handcuffed right there in the emergency hallway, in front of 2 nurses and a night-duty doctor. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He only stared straight ahead with empty eyes, while the officers read him his rights. But the law has gaps that money and connections can crawl through. Brandon Pierce was a successful lawyer. He had colleagues in every courtroom in the state. Judges he played golf with. Clients who were politicians. 12 hours after his arrest, he was released on bail. The bond was paid by a friend whose name no one knew. Brandon walked out of the police station that afternoon, his face flat and cold, as if what had happened was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in a busy schedule. Outside the station, Kendra Hale was already waiting, surrounded by a swarm of reporters she'd called there herself. She cried in front of the cameras, tears streaming down perfectly made-up cheeks, her voice breaking into sobs while every sentence landed clear as if she were reading from a script. "Brandon is the best man I've ever known," she said. "He loves his wife. He only wanted to check if she was okay. Why arrest a husband for worrying about his own wife? This is a horrible misunderstanding." Camera flashes burst white. Reporters scribbled like mad. Kendra clung to Brandon's arm in front of the lenses, her tears still falling at the right time, in the right place. In the hospital waiting room, Ryder sat on a blue plastic chair, his phone in his hand playing the live broadcast. He watched Kendra cry on the small screen, watched Brandon stand beside her wearing the face of a wronged victim. Ryder's hand tightened, not with out-of-control rage, but because he was memorizing every face, every word, every fake tear. Ryder Blackwell wasn't the kind of man who forgot. And he wasn't the kind of man who forgave. Ryder Blackwell's penthouse sat on the 25th floor of the tallest building in the city, where the streetlights far below looked like tiny scattered points, like distant stars. His study was vast, its glass wall opening onto the entire city at night. Dark-toned furnishings, a heavy oak desk set in the center, and a ceiling-high bookshelf rising behind it. Tonight, Ryder wasn't alone in this room. Finn stood beside the desk, both hands braced on the back of a leather chair, his face stern under the pale gold glow of the desk lamp. 4 other men were spaced around the room, all in dark clothing, all watching their boss seated in a black leather chair behind the desk. Ryder rested both hands on the tabletop, fingers interlaced, his eyes sweeping each face before he spoke. His voice was low and cold as always, yet something else lived beneath it tonight. A steadiness that even the men who'd followed him for years could feel had shifted. Brandon Pierce, Ryder said, the name dropping from his mouth like a stone into a deep well. I want to know everything about him. Bank accounts, domestic and overseas. Property under his name, his wife's name, the name of anyone tied to him, debts, who he owes, how much, and since when, the files at the law firm where he works, clients, financial transactions for the last 3 years, secrets, everything he's hiding. I want to know what he eats for breakfast, what time he sleeps, and what he's most afraid of. Silence filled the room. Finn nodded. How long, boss? 24 hours, Ryder replied. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The 4 men lowered their heads and left, their shadows swallowed by the thick wooden door, disappearing like darkness merging into night. Finn stayed. He understood that when the boss said 24 hours, it meant no sleep, no pause, every resource aimed at one target. And when Ryder Blackwell decided to dig into someone's past, nothing stayed buried. 20 hours later, the results came back. Finn set an iPad on Ryder's desk, the bright screen showing dozens of files, photographs, copies of bank documents, and emails pulled from sources the law would never approve, yet the underworld always reached. Brandon Pierce launders money through his law firm, Finn said, his finger sliding across the screen to open an Excel file packed with numbers. Ghost clients, fake consulting contracts. Money comes in from Cayman accounts, gets washed through the firm, then comes out looking clean. He's been doing it for at least 3 years. Ryder stared at the screen, his gaze moving line by line. Who does he owe? Dangerous people, Finn answered, clipped. A group back east. Not Mafia, but no less ruthless. The debt is $250,000. It was due last month. He hasn't paid. Ryder didn't comment. He only gave a small nod for Finn to continue. This is the good part, Finn said, swiping to another file. A copy of a life insurance policy. Life insurance on Madeline Shaw. $2 million. Beneficiary is Brandon Pierce. The policy was purchased exactly 3 months and 12 days ago. The room went still. The wall clock ticked on. Ryder stared at the date on the policy. 3 months and 12 days. That meant Brandon had planned to kill his wife long before the night on Blue Ridge. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. This was a calculated attempted murder. And this, Finn said, opening another file, this time an offshore banking report. Kendra Hale. Her name appeared beside Brandon Pierce's, on a joint account in the British Virgin Islands. The balance was $170,000, moved in small transfers over the past 6 months. Ryder watched Kendra's name on the screen, the woman Brandon called his mistress, the woman who drove the pickup that waited for him that night, the woman who cried on camera and declared Brandon innocent. She wasn't a victim who'd been fooled. She was a financial partner, an official accomplice, someone with a direct stake in Madeline's death. Anything else? Ryder asked. Emails, Finn said, pulling up a thread between Brandon and Kendra. One message from 2 months earlier had Brandon writing, "When it's done, we'll be free. $2 million is enough to clear the debt and start over. Do you trust me?" Kendra replied. "You have to make sure no one knows. Leave no trace. If there's evidence, everything collapses. Clear proof. Impossible to deny. Not love, not jealousy, not a sudden breakdown. Just money. $2 million in insurance, and a plan to erase the money laundering trail by pinning it on a dead wife labeled unstable. A woman who supposedly burned herself to death." Ryder leaned back and closed his eyes for a few seconds. When he opened them, there wasn't a trace of hesitation left. The entire picture stood in front of him, complete, like the final piece clicked into place. Brandon Pierce wasn't killing his wife out of rage. He was killing for money. Kendra Hale wasn't a puppet. She was a deliberate, intelligent accomplice with a plan and a direct interest in Madeline Shaw's death. "Copy everything," Ryder said. 2 sets. One for my private attorney, One kept here. Finn nodded. What are you going to do, boss? Ryder rose and walked to the glass wall, looking down at the city at night. Somewhere out there, Brandon Pierce was sleeping warm, believing he'd gotten away. Somewhere out there, Kendra Hale was planning her next move, believing she'd won. They didn't know that in this world, some people never forget. And Ryder Blackwell was one of them. We're going to bury him, Ryder said, his voice as cold as the ice on the crest of Blue Ridge, with the very things he's done. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the penthouse lay in darkness except for Ryder's study, still lit by a pale yellow glow. He sat behind his desk, an iPad in his hand, scrolling through every file Finn had brought back. Photos of Brandon, emails between him and Kendra, a $2 million insurance policy, lists of debts, offshore accounts. Every page, every number, every line of text was proof of a crime Brandon Pierce had been planning for months. Ryder read the last email between Brandon and Kendra again and again. The line, "When it's done, we'll be free," like the final nail sealing the coffin of any doubt that might have remained. He set the iPad down on the desk and looked out through the large glass window ahead. The city below still glittered with lights, but it was quiet now, the hour when only those who run and those who hunt are still awake. Finn stood beside the desk, arms folded, waiting for an order. He knew the boss was thinking something serious because Ryder had been silent too long, and when Ryder Blackwell was silent like that, someone always ended up paying. Ryder lifted his head to Finn, black eyes unblinking, not a flicker of emotion crossing that cold face. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, wasn't angry, wasn't rushed, only the absolute stillness of a man who had reached a final decision. Handle him, clean, no traces. 4 short words, heavy as lead. Finn understood at once. No explanation needed, no questions, no confirmation. It was an order he'd heard many times in 10 years working for Ryder Blackwell, and every time that order was given, someone vanished from this world as if they'd never existed. Finn nodded and turned toward the door. His hand had just closed around the handle when a small sound came from the hallway outside. Light footsteps, then an abrupt stop. Ryder heard it too. He stood, moved fast to the door, and pulled it open. Light spilled from the study into the dark corridor, falling across the figure standing there. Madeline Shaw. She wore an oversized cotton jacket the hospital had loaned her, her hair loosely tied back, her face still pale after days in a hospital bed. In her hand was a paper cup of water, but it tilted, the water inside nearly spilling. She stood less than half a meter from the doorway, close enough to have heard every word Ryder had just said. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, not with panic, but with something far more painful, disappointment. Ryder and Madeline stared at each other. No one spoke in a moment that stretched like a century. Finn stood behind the boss, his hand still on the door handle, staring at the woman the boss had pulled from the fire. The woman the boss hadn't left at the hospital for days. Madeline lowered the cup and set it on the small table against the hallway wall with trembling hands. She looked straight into Ryder's eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, she didn't look at him with gratitude or dependence. She looked at him with the pain of someone watching a man she believed was different turn out to be exactly like what she'd been running from. "I thought you were different," Madeline said, her voice breaking on the last word. But she didn't cry. She just stood there, both hands resting gently over her belly in the instinctive gesture of shielding her unborn child from this violent world. "I escaped a man who uses violence to solve everything. That man burned me, locked me in, tried to kill me and my baby. I thought I got out. But if you do the same thing, if you also solve everything with death, then how are you any different from him? Please don't become the second man I have to be afraid of." The words hit Ryder like a fist straight to the chest, hurting more than any bullet he'd ever taken. He stood there, one hand clenched at his side, his jaw locked, but he couldn't find a single word. Finn looked at the boss, then at Madeline, feeling the weight of the moment so strongly that even he, a man who'd watched Ryder Blackwell do the most ruthless things, didn't dare breathe. The silence stretched on. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The wall clock ticked steadily, like the heartbeat of time waiting for a decision that would change everything. Ryder looked at Madeline, at the eyes holding pain that couldn't be put into words, at the small, pregnant curve where a fragile life was growing day by day, at the small hands pressed over her belly, as if she were begging him not to turn that child's world into hell before it even had the chance to be born. And through her eyes, He looked into himself. He saw the man who commanded silence with a single word. The enforcer he'd believed he needed to be in order to survive. But in this moment, watching this frail woman stand in front of him, not begging for her own life but begging for his soul, Ryder Blackwell felt something he'd thought had died years ago begin to ache inside his chest. He turned to Finn. "Turn back." Finn flinched slightly. "Boss, cancel it," Ryder said, his voice still low, but softened just a little, the kind of softness only Penny had ever heard, and now Madeline heard it too. "Cancel everything, right now." Finn stared at his boss with undisguised shock. In 10 years, this was the first time Ryder Blackwell had ever taken back an order once it was given. But Finn didn't ask anything else. He only nodded, stepped out into the hallway, and disappeared into the dark, leaving Ryder and Madeline standing in the pale yellow light spilling from the study. Ryder turned back to Madeline. She was still there, hands on her belly, eyes on him with a small light flickering in them like hope in the middle of the night. "I'll do it your way," Ryder said. Each word fell slowly, clearly. The law, the court, the jury. "I'll give every piece of evidence to my own attorney, then to the police. Brandon will be tried. He'll go to prison for what he did. Not because I kill him, but because the law convicts him. Is that what you want?" Madeline nodded, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. She stepped closer and placed a hand on Ryder's arm. Just a light touch, but enough for him to feel the warmth of that small hand through the fabric. "Thank you," she whispered. "You just saved me again. Not from fire, from having to live with the guilt of knowing someone died because of me." Ryder didn't answer. He only stood there, looking at this woman, and for the first time in many years, he felt like he wasn't only the devil the world called him. Madeline Shaw had saved him. Not from a bullet, not from an enemy, but from himself. She wasn't only the one who'd been rescued. She was the one who had rescued what was still human inside Ryder Blackwell. 7 days later, Madeline was discharged from the hospital. Dr. Reeves did one final check, listened to the baby's heartbeat, took her blood pressure, then signed the discharge papers with careful instructions for complete rest and avoiding all stress. Ryder waited outside for her, holding a thick coat he'd bought ahead of time because the Blue Ridge air was turning colder as winter settled in. When Madeline stepped out, she still looked fragile. But she looked different too. There was something in her eyes that wasn't that blind, suffocating fear anymore, but a small hope trying hard to cling to life. On the way back, Finn drove. Ryder sat in the back seat beside Madeline, and Penny sat in the middle, twisting around again and again to look at Madeline with curious, concerned eyes. The police had issued an order barring Brandon from coming within 500 meters of Madeline, but Finn reported that Brandon had removed his electronic monitor the night before and vanished without a trace, which meant Brandon Pierce was out there somewhere, free, dangerous, and desperate. That was why Ryder didn't take Madeline to the penthouse in the city. He chose to bring her to his private estate, hidden deep in the Blue Ridge forest, nearly an hour from town, a place only the people he trusted most even knew existed. The black SUV glided along a narrow paved road that wound through the pines, then turned onto a private lane concealed by dense trees. After about 5 minutes on packed dirt, a tall iron gate appeared, 3 meters high, flanked by solid concrete walls with security cameras above. Their red lights blinking, the gate opened automatically as the vehicle approached. Inside was a wide property with a sweep of green lawn and a 2-story dark oak house with deep red roofing and 3 chimneys standing rigid like guards. Pine forest wrapped around the estate like a natural barricade, and Madeline saw at least 4 men in dark clothing spaced around the grounds, radios in hand, eyes scanning without pause. When the SUV stopped at the entrance, Penny didn't wait for Ryder to open the door. She hopped out on her own, ran into the house, then ran back with a thick gray wool blanket and a cup of hot milk still steaming. She handed the blanket to Madeline with the brightest smile an 8-year-old could manage. "You're sick, so you've got to stay warm," Penny said, solemn like a tiny doctor. "And you've got to drink milk. Uncle Ryder says milk is good for the baby." Madeline took the blanket and held it to her chest, feeling the warmth in the soft wool, and her throat tightened. How long had it been since anyone cared whether she was cold, whether she was hungry, whether she needed anything at all? Brandon had never cared, not even in the early days when he was still pretending to love her. Ryder guided Madeline inside. Penny darted ahead to open the door, then led the way up the stairs. The house was warm. A fireplace burned quietly in the living room, and the scent of wood smoke and pine drifted through the space. The furnishings were simple but high quality. Dark brown leather sofas, thick wool rugs, a long oak bookshelf along one wall, and large windows that looked out onto the pine forest behind the house. Penny brought Madeline to the second floor, to a corner room with a big bed made up in freshly washed white sheets, pale beige curtains, and a small table beside the bed holding a vase of fresh lavender. "This is your room," Penny said, then ran out for a moment and came back with a drawing in her hands. She gave it to Madeline, her cheeks flushed with shyness. "I made it for you." Madeline took the paper. It was a crayon drawing, messy in that honest way children draw, but full of heart. A small brown house, green trees all around it, and above, a big round yellow sun with bright straight rays. Beside the house were 3 figures holding hands, one tall, one small, and one with a pregnant belly. At the bottom, in uneven slanted letters, Penny had written, "Madeline's new home." Tears spilled before Madeline could stop them. She pressed the paper to her chest, her shoulders shaking, and this time she didn't try to hold it in. She cried, tears pouring for everything she hadn't had in 27 years of living. She hadn't had a home. She'd passed through 4 foster families and none of them kept her for long. She married Brandon believing it would be home, only to find it was a prison. And now, in this room, with this drawing in her hands, she felt something she'd never truly felt before. She belonged somewhere. The days that followed moved with a peace Madeline had only believed existed in movies. Every morning Penny ran into her room to wake her with a grin and tug her downstairs for breakfast, where Ryder stood in the kitchen frying eggs and making toast, awkward in the way of a man who wasn't used to a stove, yet trying with everything he had. Madeline sat at the table watching him, watching the careful way he turned the eggs, watching Penny climb onto a tall chair to help spread butter on the toast, and her chest filled with something she didn't dare name, because she was afraid it would vanish the moment she did. Penny taught her piano, simple beginner songs, Madeline's hand resting on white keys beside Penny's small hand, and the clumsy sounds they made together echoed through the living room until even Ryder, reading behind them, looked up and let a small smile slip free. One afternoon, as Madeline sat on the sofa with Ryder beside her, she suddenly felt the baby kick hard. She startled, pressed a hand to her belly, and Ryder noticed. "The baby's kicking?" he asked. Madeline nodded. Ryder hesitated, then asked quietly, "Can I touch?" She nodded again, and Ryder placed his large hand on her belly. The next moment, the baby kicked back, strong and clear, like it knew someone was listening. Ryder's eyes widened, and a rare smile appeared on the face that was usually so unreadable. Penny heard and ran over, dropping to her knees to press her ear to Madeline's belly. "I hear it. I hear the baby," she squealed. And Ryder sat there, his hand still on Madeline, watching Penny's joy, watching Madeline smile for the first time in weeks, and his eyes softened for real. Not an act, not courtesy, but a softness rising from somewhere deep in a heart he'd believed was already dead. But peace doesn't last in Ryder Blackwell's world. That night, after Madeline had gone upstairs to sleep, Ryder was in his study reviewing security reports when his phone vibrated. "Finn." His voice was more serious than usual. "Boss, Brandon Pierce has been off monitoring for 36 hours. The cameras at his house went dark, his phone's off. And Kendra Hale is gone too. Her apartment's empty, her clothes are still there, but she's not. We've lost both of them." Ryder clenched the phone in his hand. He stared out the window at the pine forest swallowed by darkness, and knew the piece he'd barely touched had already shattered. A cornered man with nothing left to lose was out there somewhere, and he was coming. That night, after Penny had gone to bed, Madeline couldn't make herself lie still in her room. She knew Brandon was out there somewhere, free, desperate, and more dangerous than ever because he had nothing left to lose. She pulled on a thick sweater, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped out onto the back porch of the mansion, where pale yellow light from inside spilled outward and laid a blurred ribbon across the wooden floorboards. Cold wind moved through the pine forest, carrying the scent of damp wood and dry grass, sharp enough to bite down to the bone. But she needed that air to breathe, to feel that she was still alive. Ryder had already been sitting there, on the long wooden bench facing the glass wall that looked out onto the dark woods, a glass of whiskey set on the railing beside him, the faint heat rising from it in the frozen air. He didn't turn when he heard Madeline's footsteps. He only shifted slightly to make room for her, and she sat down beside him in silence. The night felt heavier than any night before, not because of the wind or the deep forest dark, but because they both knew the man who had tried to kill Madeline was out there, running, planning, and sooner or later he would come back. This peace was temporary, only a pause between two storms, and they could both feel it in every breath. Ryder lifted his whiskey, took a small sip, then set it down again. His eyes fixed ahead where darkness had swallowed the horizon. "My brother's name was Ryan," Ryder began, his voice low and slow, as if he were pulling each memory out from the deepest place in his mind and bringing it into the light. "He was 3 years older than me. He was a good man, the kind this world doesn't deserve. He never got involved in what I do. He had a normal job, a good wife, and then he had Penny. But 6 years ago, he had a car wreck. A drunk guy drove the wrong way and hit him head-on. Ryan died instantly, and his wife passed away just 2 days later from internal injuries. Penny, only 2 years old then, was strapped safely into her car seat and survived without a single scratch. But in the span of those 48 hours, she had lost both of her parents forever. With no one else to turn to, I stepped in that very night to take her home." Ryder stopped and took a deep breath, his breath turning white in the cold. "I took Penny in that day. There was no one else. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, only me. And I didn't know how to take care of a 2-year-old. I only knew how to survive in the dark world I was living in. But when I looked into Penny's eyes, when I saw Ryan's eyes in them, I knew I had to change. Not completely, because I couldn't leave everything behind, but enough so Penny could have a normal life, so she wouldn't grow up in the darkness I chose." Madeline listened, both hands wrapped around her belly, feeling each small kick inside. She understood now why Ryder Blackwell, the man the entire underworld feared, could be so gentle with Penny, why he could switch from an icy voice giving orders to a soft voice asking his niece what she learned today. It wasn't an act. It was the love of a man trying to redeem himself by raising an orphan child. "You became who you are because you had to protect Penny in a world that forgives no one for being weak," Madeline said softly. Ryder nodded. "And because I went so far into the dark that I couldn't come back anymore. At least, that's what I thought. Until I met you." He turned to look at her. "You remind me there's still light out there, that not everything has to be solved with violence." Silence stretched again. The wind grew colder. Madeline tightened her scarf, stared into the darkness covering the pine forest, and for the first time since meeting Ryder, she opened herself about the most painful part of her past. "I was left at a hospital when I was born," she said, her voice so small Ryder had to lean closer to hear. "There was no paperwork, only a little slip of paper with the name Madeline. No one knew who my parents were. I grew up in an orphanage until I was 6. Then I started being placed with foster families. The first family kept me for 6 months, then sent me back because they got pregnant with their own baby. The second family kept me for a year, then got divorced, and neither of them wanted to keep me. The third family is the one I remember the most." She paused, tears swelling, but she didn't wipe them away. "They kept me for 2 years. A full 2 years. I had my own room. I had toys. I had dinner with the family. I called them Mom and Dad. I thought it was home. I thought, finally, I was going to stay somewhere." Her voice cracked. "One day I came back from school and found my things packed in a black plastic bag by the door. My clothes, my books, the only stuffed bear I had, all of it in a trash bag. They stood inside the house, looking at me through the glass, and they didn't say a word. No explanation, no apology. They just called someone from the agency to pick me up and close the door. After that, I understood one thing." She turned to Ryder, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm the kind of person who gets returned. No matter how hard I try, no matter how good I am, in the end, people always return me, because I'm not worth keeping." Ryder set the whiskey down and turned fully toward Madeline. He didn't rush to speak. He didn't pat her shoulder. He didn't offer hollow comfort. He only looked at her, for a long time, so she would know he was truly listening, truly understanding. Then he spoke, each word falling slow and heavy, like an oath that could never be broken. "You won't be returned again." Those 5 words, simple and certain, made Madeline stop crying. She looked into Ryder's eyes, black and steady, fixed on her with absolute seriousness, and for the first time in 27 years, she believed. She believed she wasn't something to be used and thrown away. She believed she deserved to stay. And she smiled. A real smile from deep inside. Not because she had to be polite. Not because she was afraid she'd be punished if she didn't smile. But because she was truly happy. It was the first time she'd smiled like that since she'd met Brandon Pierce. Maybe the first time in her entire life. That small smile lit up in the darkness, covering the Blue Ridge forest, under the threat lurking out there, beneath the storm that was about to break. But even if only for this moment, it was real. The blizzard began at 9 o'clock at night, not gradually, but crashing down like a gigantic white wall collapsing from the sky. The wind screamed through the mountain gaps with a sound like the howling of 1,000 wild beasts, carrying snowflakes as large as coins that spun madly in the air. Within an hour, the ground was covered in a thick layer of snow. First 6 inches, then 8 inches, then a full foot, and the snow still kept falling without pause. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cold wind pushed through every seam until the whole estate shuddered in waves. The road up to the house was buried, the entrance swallowed so completely it couldn't be seen, and the main road down to the city, according to the radio, had been closed by authorities because the danger was deadly. Ryder stood at the living room window and stared out. The glass layered with snow until visibility shrank to only a few yards, and even the porch light was reduced to a faint blur inside the whiteout. At 11 o'clock at night, the power went out. The entire house fell into darkness for a heartbeat. Then the backup lights kicked on automatically, a weak glow that barely showed the path from one room to the next. Ryder checked the security camera system at once. The screens were black. Every outdoor camera was dead from snow and wind, and only 2 indoor cameras still ran on backup battery. He tried his cell phone. No service. The storm had cut the signal completely. The estate was an island now, isolated in an ocean of white, unable to contact the outside world. And if something happened here, no one would know it had happened. Ryder called Finn down. The two of them checked every lock, every door, every window, making sure everything was sealed and no gap remained. Finn was assigned to the front entrance, sitting in a chair facing the main door with a handgun laid across his thigh. 2 other men from Ryder's team were posted at the back and side doors, each equipped with a flashlight and a handheld radio, even though they all knew the radios would work only at short range in a storm like this. In the living room, Madeline sat curled on the sofa with a wool blanket wrapped around her, both hands holding her pregnant belly. She felt a mild tightening roll through her abdomen, not very painful, yet strong enough to sharpen her worry. Dr. Reeves had warned her that stress could put the baby at risk, and tonight everything was stress. From the wind's relentless howl to the darkness pressing in, from the sense of being cut off to the fear that Brandon might be somewhere out there. Penny sat beside Madeline, her small body pressed close, her tiny hands wrapped around Madeline's arm, as if she were trying to pour warmth and safety into the woman she'd begun to think of as a sister these past days. "You're going to be okay," Penny whispered, her voice trembling even as she forced it steady. "Uncle Ryder will protect you. He always protects me, and now he'll protect you." Madeline held Penny tight, her eyes fixed on the window where snow hammered the glass, the wind whining through the cracks like the cry of lost spirits. Meanwhile, about 15 miles to the east, on a Blue Ridge mountain road swallowed by the blizzard, an old gray pickup tore through the white curtain at a reckless speed. Brandon Pierce sat behind the wheel, both hands gripping it so hard his knuckles were chalk white, his eyes bloodshot like a man who hadn't slept in days. Deep dark hollows carved beneath them, stubble covered his jaw and cheeks. His hair was matted with sweat and grime. The crisp white shirt he once wore like armor was stained yellow with sweat and smeared with mud, and he no longer looked like a successful attorney, only a man running from the world and from himself. On the passenger seat, a black pistol lay within reach, the magazine box open beside it, 6 rounds already loaded. Brandon drove past a huge yellow warning sign with red letters that read, "Road closed, deadly danger, do not proceed." And he didn't even slow down. He pressed harder on the gas, the pickup trembling as the tires clawed through deep snow, sliding toward the edge more than once, then correcting and lunging forward again. His lips kept moving, muttering words no one could hear except him. "If I can't have it, no one can. No one can. She's mine. The baby is mine. The money is mine. It's all mine. If I lose everything, I'll destroy everything. No one gets anything from me. No one." He repeated it like a mad prayer, his voice breaking, choking, then rising again under the roar of the wind. Through the snow-coated windshield, His face was the face of a man who had lost everything. Career collapsing, money gone, reputation shattered, and his obsession with Madeline Shaw had swallowed the last of his survival instinct. He wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. He wasn't afraid of police or court. He didn't care whether he lived through the night. Only one purpose kept burning in his unraveled mind. If he couldn't have Madeline, if he couldn't have the child, if he couldn't have the $2 million from the policy, then no one would. He would end it all tonight, inside this storm, a lone, desperate man against a savage world, and the madness of that loneliness made him more dangerous than any crew of gunmen, because a man with nothing left to lose is the most frightening man alive. Bam! The back kitchen door of the mansion was kicked clean off with a crash that cut through the howling wind like thunder. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a lock being picked. It was wood, splintering as something slammed into it with the full, desperate force of a madman. Brandon Pierce stormed in, snow-caked thick on his hair and shoulders, melting into small drops that ran down his stubbled face, his eyes bloodshot, looking like a wounded animal hunting its last prey. In his right hand was a black handgun, his finger already on the trigger, and his gaze swept the dark kitchen lit only by a weak emergency light spilling from the hallway. Finn heard the impact from his post at the front door, spun, and ran for the back with the speed of a man trained for danger, pulling his gun from its holster as he moved. But Brandon was already inside. The two men faced each other in the kitchen, dim light throwing their large shadows onto the wall. Finn didn't shout. He didn't warn. He knew a man who charged through a blizzard like this no longer had enough reason left for negotiation. Finn lunged, reaching to strip the gun from Brandon's hand. But Brandon reacted with raw, uncalculated frenzy, twisting aside and shoving Finn hard into the kitchen island. Finn caught his balance and came again. They grappled, Finn's hand clamping around Brandon's gun wrist, trying to wrench it down. But Brandon drove a knee into Finn's stomach, then smashed an elbow into his face. In the struggle, Brandon's finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot cracked deafeningly in the enclosed space. A flash spat from the barrel. The bullet tore diagonally across the kitchen and buried itself in the oak wall, leaving a small black hole ringed by spidering cracks. The blast hit like an alarm bell, echoing through the mansion, drowning even the wind screaming outside. Brandon used the split-second Finn, flinched at the shot. He threw all his weight forward, ramming Finn into the counter. Finn's back slammed into the hard wooden edge. A painful sound forced its way up from his throat as his body tipped to one side. Brandon didn't stop to keep fighting. He knew he didn't have much time before others in the mansion arrived. He turned his back on Finn, who was struggling to get up, and burst out of the kitchen, pounding down the dark hallway, his heavy steps hammering the floorboards like war drums. He knew the layout because he'd spent 3 days watching the place from a distance, through binoculars before choosing tonight to break in. He knew where the upstairs living room was, where the bedrooms were, and he knew exactly where Madeline would run when she heard a gunshot. Brandon took the stairs in a rush, skipping steps, 3 at a time, the gun still clenched tight in his hand, his breath coming out in white streams in the freezing air of the powerless mansion. He reached the upstairs living room and saw the corner room door, the door he knew Madeline was behind. He didn't knock. He didn't test the handle. He only stepped back 2 paces and kicked straight into the lock. The first kick made the door shudder but not open. The second kick blew the lock. The door flew inward and slammed the wall with a bang. Inside, the only light was from a small candle on a table, and in that thin glow, Brandon saw Madeline standing in the middle of the room, with Penny hidden behind her, tiny hands fisted tight in Madeline's sweater. Penny screamed, a shrill, tearing scream from an 8-year-old watching a nightmare become real. But Madeline didn't scream. She only stood there with her arms spread wide like a living shield, protecting Penny behind her, her eyes locked on Brandon without blinking. Brandon stepped into the room, shut the door with his foot, and lifted the gun, aiming straight at Madeline. Candlelight reflected off the steel, throwing cold, dancing streaks across the walls. His mouth moved, his lips were cracked from cold and dehydration, and his voice broke into pieces as he spoke. "If I can't have you, no one can." Those words dropped like a death sentence. He moved closer. The distance between the muzzle and Madeline's chest was now less than 2 meters. "I gave you a chance. I gave you everything. But you chose him, chose that criminal instead of your husband. So now you all die. You, the baby in your belly, and that kid behind you. All of you die with me tonight," Penny sobbed, her whole body shaking in jerks. But Madeline didn't move. She stayed upright, her arms still out, her body the only shield left between death and the terrified child behind her. And in that moment, between the gun barrel and the candle flame, between the storm outside and the frightening stillness inside the room, Madeline Shaw, the woman who for 27 years had only lowered her head when Brandon shouted, only stayed silent when Brandon hit, only endured when Brandon tormented her, the woman who had believed she was the kind of person who got returned and didn't deserve to be loved, did something she had never thought she could do. She stepped forward. It was a small step, trembling, but it was forward, not backward the way she always had before, whenever she faced Brandon. She nudged Penny farther behind her, using her body as a wall between the gun barrel and the 8-year-old shaking like a reed. Madeline stood tall, taller than she'd stood in the past 2 years of living with Brandon, her shoulders drawn tight, her chin slightly lifted, and her arms spread wide to either side like wings trying to shield the life behind her. This woman, who had spent her whole life either being protected by others or drowning in the desperation of having no one to protect her, was now standing in front of a gun to protect a child who wasn't hers, and in that act, she became the strongest version of herself she had never known she could be. Her voice came out unsteady but clear, each word spoken with a steadiness that surprised even her. Shoot me. If you want to kill someone, shoot me. But don't touch this child. I'm begging you. Shoot me, but let her live. She didn't blink. She stared straight at Brandon, no longer with the terrified gaze of an abused wife, but with the eyes of a mother willing to die to protect her child, even if that child wasn't her biological daughter. Brandon stood there, the gun still aimed at Madeline, but his finger on the trigger began to shake, not from the cold, but because for the first time in his life, he was looking at this woman, and she wasn't afraid of him anymore. He saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before, a willingness to sacrifice, and it made him hesitate. 2 seconds. Only 2 seconds, but long enough for the world to change. A shadow appeared in the doorway behind Brandon. Ryder Blackwell stepped into the room, his left shoulder soaked with blood, red seeping into the black fabric of his shirt, maybe from a collision with someone downstairs, or from a splinter of the broken door frame driven in when he tried to stop Brandon from forcing his way inside. But his eyes were tempered steel, cold as the ice on the mountain peak, locked on the back of Brandon's neck. His voice rang out, not loud, yet carrying the weight of a man who never spoke without meaning it. Put the gun down. Brandon flinched and turned halfway, but he kept the weapon pointed at Madeline. He saw Ryder coming toward him, step by step, slow and even, not rushing, like a man approaching a wounded animal. And what terrified Brandon most wasn't that Ryder was coming closer, but that he was coming with nothing in his hands. No gun, no knife, no club. Only empty hands and that piercing stare, looking at Brandon like he was already dead. "One more step and I'll shoot her," Brandon screamed, his voice cracking into a wild shriek. But Ryder didn't stop. He kept walking, one step at a time, shrinking the distance from 5 meters to 4, to 3, to 2. Brandon stared into Ryder's eyes, and for the first time he saw something a gun couldn't handle. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was willingness to die. Ryder Blackwell was moving toward him like a man with nothing left to lose. A man ready to take the bullet into his own body if that was what it took to rip the weapon away a heartbeat later. And that readiness, that look, made Brandon's hands shake harder. The gun barrel lowered slowly, not because Brandon wanted it to, but because his survival instinct recognized that if he shot Madeline, Ryder would tear his throat out with bare hands the next second. The distance was down to 1 meter. When Ryder reached out, not fast, not slow, simply reaching as if he were taking back something that already belonged to him. In that exact moment, Finn charged into the room from behind Ryder. The 40-year-old man, shoulders as broad as a doorway and hands like hammers, ignored the injury on his back, where Brandon had struck him earlier and slammed forward, one hand wrenching the barrel up toward the ceiling, the other fisting Brandon's collar and hauling him down onto the wooden floor. The impact boomed as Brandon's back hit the boards. The gun flew from his hand, skittered across the floor, and came to rest beneath the bed. Finn dropped a knee onto Brandon's back, drove his weight into Brandon's chest, and pinned his wrists behind him. With his free hand, he pulled a rope from his pocket and bound Brandon tight. Brandon screamed, not a scream of pain but of madness, his voice breaking into shrill, splintering cries. "Madeline, Madeline, you're mine. You'll always be mine. Do you hear me?" No one's taking you. No one. He shouted her name again and again, his voice turning hoarse, turning darker, turning more unhinged, until Finn shoved a strip of cloth into his mouth and gagged him, leaving only muffled sounds bubbling in his throat, sounds that were swallowed by the wind howling beyond the windows, the blizzard still tearing through Blue Ridge, as if it meant to wipe every sin clean. Madeline stood there, her legs suddenly gone weak, and then she folded to the floor, her knees hitting the wood, both arms wrapping her belly, and she cried. She cried not from fear, not from pain, but from relief, from exhaustion, from months of tension finally spilling out into tears that fell onto the boards. Penny ran to her and clung to her, tiny arms looping around Madeline's neck, her face buried into Madeline's shoulder, her small body shaking in waves. "You saved me. You saved me," Penny sobbed. Ryder stepped closer and dropped to his knees beside them, his large arms wrapped around both Madeline and Penny, pulling them into his chest, using his body to cover them like the last fortress against anything that might still come. Blood still ran from his shoulder, but he didn't care. He only held the two females, one grown, one small, both of them people he was willing to die for. Outside the windows, the storm kept screaming as if it wanted to rip the sky apart. Snow kept falling in thick sheets, whitening everything. Wind kept slicing through the mountain gaps with a cold that cut to the bone. But inside this small room, beneath the flicker of candlelight and the weight of darkness, there was a different kind of quiet, not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of safety. Madeline rested her head against Ryder's chest and listened to his heartbeat. Steady, powerful, alive, and she knew it was over. The man who'd tried to kill her lay pinned on the floor, bound and gagged, stripped of power. And she, Madeline Shaw, the woman who had once believed she was someone meant to be returned, was now being held by two people who would never leave her. The storm broke at 6 o'clock in the morning. The wind eased, the snow stopped falling, and the sky shifted from black to pale gray until the first rays of sunlight began to slip through gaps in the clouds. Ryder sat in his study, cell service finally back, and he called the police immediately. He didn't call Finn to handle Brandon the way the underworld would. He didn't order anyone to do what Ryder Blackwell was fully capable of doing, what no one could have stopped him from doing. He called the police, gave them the exact address, Brandon Pierce's condition, and demanded they come at once to arrest him by proper legal procedure. It was the promise he'd made Madeline that night on the porch, the promise that he'd do it her way, not with violence but with justice, and Ryder Blackwell never broke his word to the people he cared about. Police arrived an hour after the road was plowed, 3 patrol cars with red and blue lights flashing, 6 officers stepping out in thick cold weather uniforms. They entered the mansion and found Brandon Pierce sitting on the living room floor, his hands bound behind his back, one side of his face swollen from the collision with Finn, his eyes still bloodshot, but no longer wild, only empty, exhausted, like a man who had run to the end of the road and discovered there was nowhere left to hide. The officers removed Finn's ties, replaced them with freezing metal handcuffs, read Brandon his rights as they led him outside. Snow lay deep across the yard, glittering under the early morning sun like a massive white cloth spread flat, and Brandon walked through it, his boots sinking with every step, the cuffs clinking each time he shifted. Madeline stood at the living room window watching, Ryder beside her, Penny holding Madeline's hand on the other side. When Brandon was pushed into the police car, he twisted his head back and looked up at the window. His eyes found Madeline, and he screamed, his madness carrying through the thick glass. "She'll never get away from me. You hear me, Madeline. You'll always be mine." But Madeline only stood there, looking at him without blinking, without trembling, without shrinking the way she always had when Brandon shouted in her face. This time she simply watched, and in her eyes there was no fear, only the relief of knowing this man would never touch her again. The police car door slammed shut, cutting off Brandon's scream, and the cars rolled away, tires crushing the snow and leaving 2 long black tracks across the white, before disappearing around the bend. 2 days later, Kendra Hale was arrested at a state border checkpoint, trying to drive into the next state in a sedan packed with luggage stacked on the back seat and trunk. When officers ordered her out, Kendra began crying instantly, tears streaming, hands shaking as she handed over her documents, sobbing that she was the victim, that Brandon had forced her to do everything, that she had only loved him and trusted him and that was how she'd been tricked. But the police didn't believe her, because they had the evidence Ryder had turned over, the joint bank accounts between Kendra and Brandon. The emails discussing the plan to kill Madeline and split the insurance money. Security footage showing Kendra herself driving the pickup truck the night Brandon set Madeline's vehicle on fire on the mountain. And most of all, the recorded call Kendra made to Madeline at the hospital, trying to trap her into saying vague things that could be used as proof. Madeline was delusional. A call Madeline had recorded with a different phone, a nurse had lent her after she realized what Kendra was trying to do. Kendra Hale was handcuffed and led away, tears still falling, but this time they were real tears from a woman who knew she couldn't escape anymore. 3 weeks later, Madeline decided to speak publicly. She sat in front of the camera for a major television network. Ryder beside her, saying nothing, but his presence alone enough to make her feel safe. Madeline told her story from beginning to end, without hiding anything, without dressing it up. Only the raw truth of a woman whose husband tried to kill her, and who survived by sheer luck. She spoke about the night on the mountain, the fire, the sensation of being abandoned inside death, the stranger who saved her, and the journey back to herself. The video was posted online, and within 6 hours, the hashtag Justice for Madeline was trending across the United States. Millions watched, hundreds of thousands shared. And what shocked Madeline most was that thousands of women began writing to her, sending emails, leaving comments, each one telling her own story of domestic violence, of near deaths, of the fear that kept them silent, and how seeing Madeline stand up had given them the courage to stand up too. Madeline sat on the mansion sofa with an iPad on her lap, scrolling through message after message, email after email, and she cried as she read them, but this time the tears weren't pain. They were the tears of someone realizing for the first time that she wasn't alone, that thousands of other women out there had lived and were living what she had lived, and now all of them were holding hands through a screen, through lines of text, through shared truth, forming an invisible web of strength and hope. The trial took place on a morning in early February, and the Blue Ridge County Courthouse was so packed that security had to stand at the doors and stop anyone else from coming in. Reporters had arrived from all over the country, cameras lined up in long rows outside, and the courtroom itself was filled to the edges with people who came to watch, some women who had written letters to Madeline, some simply curious to witness the case that had shaken the nation. Brandon Pierce was led in with his hands cuffed tight in front of him, wearing an orange inmate uniform, his face pale like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks, his cheekbones hollow, dark bruised circles under his eyes, his beard thick and untrimmed. He was no longer the polished attorney in expensive suits with a charming smile, just a criminal in custody finally facing the consequences of what he'd done. Kendra Hale sat at the defense table beside him, her body trembling without stop even though the courtroom wasn't cold, her hands on the table clenched together until her knuckles turned white. When the courtroom doors opened and Madeline walked in, the entire room fell silent. She wore a simple navy blue long dress, her hair neatly tied back, her pregnancy now more visible at 22 weeks, and she moved with the calm of someone who had walked through hell and lived. Ryder walked beside her in a black three-piece suit, exactly as people had seen him in the articles, and on Madeline's other side, Penny held her hand, the 8-year-old in a small white dress with a pink bow in her hair. They took their seats in the row reserved for the plaintiff, and Brandon turned to look at Madeline, his eyes empty, yet still carrying something obsessive that wouldn't go away. The prosecutor began presenting evidence, each piece of the case laid out with methodical, ruthless precision. A large screen at the front of the courtroom played hospital security footage showing Brandon slipping into Madeline's room at 2 o'clock in the morning, standing beside her bed as she slept, then reaching out to pull the oxygen tube away. The image in black and white, yet clear enough for everyone to see the undeniable intent to kill. A sharp, stunned intake of breath rose from the gallery. Next came a gasoline receipt, purchased by Brandon exactly 3 hours before Madeline was trapped in the burning vehicle, at a gas station 12 miles from the scene. Then the life insurance policy for Madeline Shaw, $2 million, beneficiary Brandon Pierce, purchased exactly 3 months and 12 days before the night of the fire. Then a copy of an offshore account in the British Virgin Islands, bearing the names Brandon Pierce and Kendra Hale as joint holders, with a balance of $170,000. Then the recorded phone call between Kendra and Madeline at the hospital. Kendra's voice so sweet it was unsettling as she tried to trap Madeline into saying she didn't remember clearly what happened. The audio filling the courtroom and making more than a few people shake their heads in disbelief. An arson expert was called to the stand, a gray-haired man with 30 years of experience, who explained in detail the gasoline patterns around the vehicle, how the fire had been ignited from the outside, how the car doors had been deliberately locked from the outside, all of it proving this wasn't an accident, but a planned attempt at murder. Dr. Reeves took the stand next and described Madeleine's condition when she arrived at the hospital. Severe lung damage from smoke inhalation, the fetus in critical condition, and how, if they'd been even 5 minutes later, neither mother nor child could have been saved. The jury of 12 sat in silence, eyes fixed on the screen, on the evidence, on Brandon with his head down and his gaze refusing to lift, and there was no doubt left in their faces. But just when everyone thought the trial would end with an obvious verdict, defense attorney Warren Holt rose from the table. He was 55, salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back, wearing an expensive gray suit and gold-rimmed glasses, one of the best criminal defense lawyers in the state, with a staggering win rate. He didn't defend Brandon by claiming innocence, because the evidence was far too clear to deny, and instead he attacked from an entirely different direction. Warren Holt walked to the center of the courtroom holding a thick file, and his voice rang out strong and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm not standing here to tell you my client didn't do the things the prosecutor has presented. I'm standing here to tell you there's a larger picture, a truth the media won't say and the public doesn't know." He opened the file and put Ryder Blackwell's image on the screen, photos from police records, old convictions, intelligence reports about illegal activity. Ryder Blackwell, the man sitting beside Madeleine Shaw, is not simply a kind stranger who rescued someone in need. He is the leader of an underground criminal organization. He has a record involving violence, smuggling, money laundering. He is a man the FBI has watched for years but has never had enough evidence to convict. And now I ask you this. A man like that appears at the exact right moment to save Madeleine Shaw, then takes her to his private estate, cuts off all contact with the outside world. Isn't that coincidence? Just a little too perfect. Madeleine Shaw is not a simple victim. She has been used by a dangerous criminal, manipulated, brainwashed, turned into a tool to bring down my client. The courtroom jolted. Whispering broke out everywhere. The jurors turned to look at Ryder with eyes that were different now. No longer respect, but suspicion. Fear. Reporters hammered at their laptops. And within 10 minutes, a new hashtag surfaced across social media. "Who is Ryder Blackwell?" spreading as fast as wildfire. Ryder sat motionless in his seat, his expression unchanged, his dark eyes fixed forward without blinking, without reacting, like a stone statue in the middle of the storm rising around him. But Madeleine glanced down and saw his hand on his thigh tightening into a fist, the knuckles gone white, tendons standing out across the back of his hand, the only sign that inside this calm man, a violent, unseen tide was building. After attorney Warren Holt sat down with the confidence of a man who believed he'd planted doubt in the jury's mind, the prosecutor called the final witness. The state calls Miss Madeleine Shaw to the stand. The entire courtroom fell silent as Madeleine rose, her 22-week belly clearly visible beneath a navy dress, and she walked to the witness stand with steps that were slow, but steady. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, then took her seat facing hundreds of eyes fixed on her. The prosecutor asked the basic questions about the night of the fire, about what Brandon had done, and Madeleine answered each one clearly, without hesitation. Then it was Warren Holt's turn. He stood, approached the witness stand, and behind gold-rimmed glasses, his eyes held the sharp focus of a man who had cross-examined thousands of witnesses and knew how to make them shake. "Miss Shaw," his tone, polite but cold, "are you aware that Ryder Blackwell is a criminal?" Silence. The courtroom held its breath, waiting. Madeleine looked down at her hands resting in her lap, her fingers woven together. Then she lifted her gaze, not to Holt, but straight to the jury, meeting the eyes of each of the 12, and she spoke. "I know who he is. I know his past isn't clean." A murmur rippled through the room. Warren Holt smiled, thinking he'd won. But Madeleine wasn't finished. "But let me tell you what else I know. That night, when my husband poured gasoline around the car, I was locked inside. When he struck the lighter and walked away without looking back even once, I thought I was going to die. I thought no one would stop, no one would care, because I was just an unknown woman on an empty mountain road. But he stopped. Ryder Blackwell, the man you're doubting, was the only person on that road that night who pulled over. He didn't know who I was. He wasn't paid. He just saw someone dying in a fire, and he ran in. He smashed the window with his bare hands and dragged me out as the vehicle exploded right after. If he'd been 10 seconds slower, my baby and I would be dead. Madeline's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. After that, at 2 o'clock in the morning at the hospital, when my husband slipped into my room and tried to pull my oxygen line to kill me a second time, Ryder Blackwell's people stood guard at my door all night to protect me. They caught Brandon with his hand reaching out to murder me. Then, on the blizzard night, when my husband broke into the mansion with a gun, put that gun on me and an 8-year-old child, Ryder Blackwell walked into that room with nothing in his hands. No gun, no knife, no armor, only his bare hands and the willingness to die to protect us. Madeline turned and looked at Brandon at the defense table, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. You want to know who the real criminal is? I'll tell you. That man, Brandon Pierce, is a lawyer. He wears expensive suits, crisp white shirts. He speaks sweetly to everyone. He smiles wide for his clients. He has degrees. He has a reputation. He has the perfect appearance. But that same man locked his pregnant wife in a car, poured gasoline, lit a match, and walked away. So you tell me, who is the dangerous one? The man with a dark past who saves a stranger's life? Or the man with a law license who tries to burn his wife alive? Tears ran down Madeline's cheeks, but her voice didn't break anymore. Now it was strong, clear, carrying across the courtroom. Ryder Blackwell isn't perfect. He has a past I can't defend. But he was the only one who stood up to protect me when the whole world turned its back. And if that makes him a criminal, then I'm here to say this world needs more criminals like that. Attorney Warren Holt had no more questions. A female juror in the first row wiped tears with a tissue, her shoulders trembling faintly. 2 men on the jury stared down at the table, throats working as they swallowed hard. Madeline Shaw was no longer a fragile woman who needed protecting. In that courtroom, she had become the one protecting Ryder Blackwell, the man who protected her when she had no one left. The jury retired to deliberate at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 hours later, they returned. The judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, a gray-haired man around 60, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hand. "We have, Your Honor. As to the defendant Brandon Pierce, on the charge of premeditated attempted murder, how do you find?" "Guilty, Your Honor." As to the defendant Kendra Hale, on the charge of conspiracy to commit attempted murder, how do you find? "Guilty, Your Honor." The judge struck the gavel. "Brandon Pierce, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without parole, without clemency. Kendra Hale, 25 years in prison." Brandon screamed, his face twisting, his cuffed hands crashing against the table with a harsh clatter. "No, this isn't fair. She's lying. They're all lying." But officers hauled him up and dragged him from the courtroom while he kept shouting until his voice faded behind the door. Kendra collapsed, her face buried in her hands, sobbing. But no one in that courtroom felt sorry for her. Madeline sat in her seat, tears streaming. But this time they were the tears of a free woman, the tears of someone who didn't have to live in fear anymore. Outside the courthouse, under the late afternoon sun, Ryder stood beside Madeline, Penny holding Madeline's hand on the other side. Reporters crowded in, but security kept them at a safe distance. Ryder looked at Madeline, his voice low and sincere. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to protect me in court." Madeline turned to him, her eyes still wet, but no longer full of pain. "You stood in front of a gun for me. I stood in front of the court for you. That's what fairness looks like." And for the first time since the beginning of the story, since the night he pulled her from the fire, since all the days of pain and terror, Ryder Blackwell smiled. Not a cold smile, not a mocking smile, but a real one, rising from deep inside, lighting his once shadowed eyes and drawing fine lines at their corners. The smile of a man who had finally been redeemed. The months after the trial passed in a peace Madeline had never believed could exist in real life. The estate tucked deep in the Blue Ridge forest became a true home, a place where she woke each morning no longer carrying fear, only calm. Penny often sat beside Madeline on the sofa, pressing her ear to the belly that grew larger by the week and singing little songs she'd learned in music class, her clear voice floating softly like a lullaby for the unborn child. "The baby has to hear music starting now," Penny would explain with grave seriousness, "so he'll be smart later." She even played the piano close to Madeline's belly, convinced the sound would help the baby get used to the world outside. Ryder, whose reputation usually cast a long, cold shadow, spent a full week painting the small room next to the master bedroom with his own hands, turning it into a nursery. The sight of Ryder Blackwell in an old t-shirt smeared with paint, a brush in his hand, carefully coating each corner of the wall in a pale blue, while Penny sat on the floor drawing animals on large sheets of paper to tape up afterward, was such a powerful contradiction that Madeline more than once had to stop in the doorway just to stare and convince herself it was real and not a dream. At dawn, on a day in mid-June, when the first sunlight slipped through the pine branches outside the window, Madeline woke to a violent pain spreading across her belly. She knew immediately what it was. She'd read enough books and listened to Dr. Reeves explain it in detail. But when it truly arrived, fear still crashed over her. Ryder woke at once at the sound of her ragged breathing. He sprang up, told Finn to get the car ready, called the hospital to tell them they were on the way, then came back to hold Madeline, help her into a thick coat, and guide her step by step down the stairs, while Penny ran behind them carrying the bag they'd packed weeks earlier. The entire drive to the hospital, Ryder sat in the back beside Madeline, gripping her hand and speaking simple words that were honest. "You can do this. I'm here. You're not alone." Each time the pain hit, Madeline squeezed his hand so hard her nails dug into his skin, but Ryder didn't flinch. He only squeezed back and reminded her to breathe. At the hospital, in the delivery room under harsh white lights and steady beeping machines, with Dr. Reeves and 2 nurses at her side, Madeline endured 9 hours of pain she thought she couldn't survive, but each time she felt herself breaking. She looked up and saw Ryder beside the bed, his eyes never leaving her for even a second, his hand holding hers, and she found the strength to push a little longer. Penny waited in the hallway the entire 9 hours, arms folded tight against her chest, lips moving in prayers she'd learned at the small church at the foot of the mountain. And every time a nurse passed, she asked, "Is Madeline okay?" with the worried voice of a child waiting for the most important news of her life. Then, at 3 in the afternoon, as late sunlight slipped through the delivery room window, a small cry rang out, sharp and strong, the most beautiful sound Madeline had ever heard. Dr. Reeves cut the cord, the nurse cleaned the baby, and placed him on Madeline's chest. A boy, weighing 7 pounds 1 ounce, eyes squeezed tight, fists clenched, skin pink and warm, crying with fierce life. Ryder stood at the bedside, looking down at the baby, then at Madeline, and for the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears, not from pain, not from anger, from something he thought he could no longer feel. Pure joy. He dropped to his knees by the bed, one hand resting over Madeline's, the other touching the baby's head as gently as a blessing, and his voice broke when he spoke. "You're safe. Your son is safe." Penny was allowed into the room. She ran to the bed, eyes wide as she stared at the baby in Madeline's arms. "He's so tiny," she cried. "That's my little brother now." She reached out, and with Dr. Reeves guiding her hands, Penny carefully held the baby and sat in the chair beside the bed, gazing down at the small face with the absolute seriousness of an 8-year-old who'd just been given a sacred responsibility. At 3 in the morning the next day, Madeline lay in her hospital room, exhausted after 9 hours of labor, asleep in the first deep sleep she'd had in months. The baby lay in the bassinet beside her, and then suddenly he began to cry, small but loud enough to wake Ryder in the chair by the bed. Ryder stood up, saw Madeline still sleeping, then leaned down and lifted the baby into his arms. Ryder Blackwell, a man whose very name was synonymous with absolute authority, the man who had ordered killing more times than anyone could count, was now holding a newborn light as a feather, walking back and forth across the hospital room with steps so quiet they made no sound. He sang a lullaby in a low, rough voice that didn't know how to sing, offbeat, forgetting the words and finding them again, completely clumsy. But he sang, his face bent close to the baby, with a tenderness no one but Penny had ever seen. And slowly the baby stopped crying. His tiny eyes opened and looked up at Ryder's face, then drifted closed again, peaceful in Ryder's arms. Madeline woke, her eyes hazy in the darkness lit only by a small lamp in the corner, and she saw that scene. Ryder stood near the window, holding the baby, moonlight slipping through the curtain and falling over both of them, making a picture more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen. Tears slid onto Madeline's pillow and soaked into the white fabric, and she whispered, so softly only she could hear it, "This is home." A week after she was discharged, Madeline sat in a lawyer's office, a pen in her hand, the divorce papers from Brandon Pierce laid in front of her. There was no drama, no tears, no hesitation. She simply signed her name on the final line, her handwriting clear and steady, then set the pen down. The attorney looked at her and asked, "Are you sure, ma'am?" And Madeline smiled, for the first time in her life, not because she was afraid, but because she was relieved. "I'm sure." When she stepped out of the law office, the Blue Ridge summer sun was bright overhead. Madeline drew in a deep breath, felt clean air fill her lungs, and she knew that from this moment on, she was truly free. Love didn't arrive in a single night. It grew slowly, over months of peace. Ryder didn't pressure her, didn't rush her. He was simply there, patient, letting Madeline's heart open at its own pace. Mornings, they drank coffee together on the porch and watched the sun rise behind the pines, talking about small things in the day, or sometimes just sitting side by side in silence without feeling awkward. Evenings, they walked the edge of the woods, Penny pushing the stroller with the sleeping baby, Ryder walking beside Madeline at a distance that was respectful, yet close enough that she always knew he was there if she needed him. Laughter filled the house when Penny played hide-and-seek with the baby who had learned to crawl. Ordinary moments that somehow felt more precious than gold. One autumn night, when pine needles fell in bright gold outside, Madeline and Ryder sat on the long porch bench under a shared wool blanket, and Ryder turned to her, his eyes more serious than she'd ever seen them. "I know you've been through too much. I know you need time. But I want you to know one thing. I love you. Not because you're fragile and need saving. Because you're strong. You stood up in fire. You protected Penny with a gun pointed at you. You stood in court and told the truth while the whole world doubted you. You're the only person who ever looked me in the eyes and told me I could be better. And you were right. I changed because of you." Madeline stayed quiet for a long time, both hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, staring into the dark pine forest. Then she turned back to Ryder with a small smile, the most sincere smile she had. "I love you too, not because you saved me from the fire, even though I'll never forget that. Because after you saved me, you stayed. You didn't walk away the way people always did with me. You stayed even knowing I carried too many wounds. And most of all, you chose to change. You chose the law over violence. You chose to become a better man. That's why I love you." Their wedding took place on a quiet, small spring afternoon the next year, on the mansion grounds beneath fresh green pines, without hundreds of guests or a booming orchestra, only Finn and a few trusted people, a gray-haired pastor from the small town, and gentle sunlight slipping through the leaves. Penny scattered flower petals along the aisle in a pale pink dress, beaming so brightly she couldn't stand still. Madeline wore a simple white gown with no lace and no beading, her hair down, a bouquet of pale purple lavender in her hands. Ryder waited at the end of the aisle in a crisp black suit, and when Madeline reached him, he took her hand and held it tight, as if he'd never let go. This time Madeline wasn't marrying out of fear, not out of loneliness, not out of desperation for somewhere to cling. She was marrying safety, respect, and real love. Years later, Madeline sat on the wooden porch chair on a summer afternoon, watching her son, now 5 years old, run across the green lawn with a red kite snapping behind him. Inside the house, piano music drifted through the rooms. Penny, now 13, hair to her shoulders, playing a Mozart piece with the practiced skill of someone who had studied for years. Ryder stood beside Madeline, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, looking down with a warm smile. Madeline looked at her own hand, at the faint scar on her wrist, the mark left from the night of the burning car on the Blue Ridge Mountain Road, the scar that reminded her she had survived hell. She whispered, her voice light as wind, "We survived, and we deserve to be loved." Madeline Shaw's story is a story of survival, of the courage to stand when the whole world is pressing down on your shoulders, of finding yourself again in the ashes. It is also a reminder that domestic violence isn't rare. It's happening all around us, behind closed doors, inside homes that look perfect from the outside. If you or someone you know is going through something similar, remember you aren't alone. You deserve to be safe, and you can get out. If this story touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button on our channel, like, and share this video so more people can hear it and find hope. We post moving stories every day, stories about people, about love, about life. Leave a comment below and share how you feel about this story. What do you think about Madeline's journey? And does it connect to your own life in any way? We truly want to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for staying with this long story all the way to the end. We wish you abundant health, a peaceful life, and days filled with joy. Remember, no matter how hard life gets, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.